as I wandered through the grand, marble-lined halls of ancient Alexandria, where thinkers wrestled with ideas of virtue and mathematicians traced the Earth's curves, I learned about a young princess grappling with a grim truth. True power stemmed not from wisdom or kindness, but from surviving the unbearable. This tale isn't about scholarly victories or the splendor of old empires. It's about how one woman's personal pain shaped the laws of a nation, how her private wounds turned into lasting traditions, and how the ancient world's mightiest family sowed the seeds of its own downfall by embracing incest. Her name was Arsinoë II, and she didn't just break taboos, she made them law. She wove her trauma into the fabric of politics, a choice that tainted the Ptolemaic line for centuries. This isn't the story of a bold leader or a heartbroken heroine. It's a troubling account of how history can be molded by broken people, whose unhealed scars become the bedrock of empires. Arsinoë II grew up in a ruthless world, where daughters were little more than pawns and family bonds paled next to the pull of power. She took that shattered world and forged it into a weapon, one that ended up destroying the very legacy she aimed to protect. Her life unfolds like a dark Greek play. The one who suffers becomes the one who inflicts suffering, and surviving means embracing the horrors that once scarred you. What makes Arsinoë's story so unsettling isn't just the cruelty or corruption. It's how she methodically turned taboos like incest, murder, and deceit into standard practice at court. She didn't act out of anger or haste. She crafted a system, a blueprint that later rulers followed, each one more twisted than the last. The Ptolemaic dynasty, kicked off by one of Alexander the Great's sharpest generals, ended with Cleopatra VII, a name that conjures both allure and ruin. But the roots of that collapse were planted long before by a queen who believed no boundary was too sacred to cross for the sake of power. This is Arsinoë II's story, and it doesn't start with a crown. It begins with a childhood that could have broken anyone. To get Arsinoë II, you've got to understand the world she was born into. Around 316 BCE, the Mediterranean was a mess. Alexander the Great was dead, and his vast empire was being sliced up like a pie by his former generals, the decay or successors. These guys waged endless battles for land, glory, and the right to call themselves king. One of them, Ptolemaic II, claimed Egypt and made Alexandria his base. That's where the Ptolemaic dynasty began, blending Greek and Egyptian ways, though only skin deep. The court in Alexandria was a weird mix. You had Macedonian warrior traditions crashing into Egyptian god-king worship. Scrolls of Plato sat alongside statues of Greek deities stood next to temples covered in hieroglyphs. But for all its cultural flair, the Ptolemaic court was a brutal machine fueled by scheming and bloodshed. The Ptolemies were conquerors, plain and simple, holding power not through loyalty or rightful rule, but through raw force and cunning deals. One of their darkest, most effective tools was the Egyptian custom of royal incest. In this world, royal women weren't seen as daughters, sisters, or wives. They were game pieces. A princess could be a diplomatic prize, a bargaining tool, or a locked-away treasure to keep her bloodline from rival hands. A royal daughter's value lay in her lineage, since in a world where power passed through blood, whoever controlled that blood could claim the throne. This twisted setup led to something horrific. Fathers who saw their daughters as both assets and dangers. Protecting a daughter might mean marrying her to an aging general, or even taking her as a wife yourself. Arsinoë was born smack in the middle of this chaos. Her dad was Ptolemy I, and her mom was Berenice, one of his wives. From her earliest days, she lived under the shadow of court violence. Executions, poisoned cups, murders dressed up as accidents. But the public cruelties weren't what hit her hardest. It was the private ones. Ancient sources drop hints, cloaked in vague terms, about Ptolemy's troubling affection for his daughters. They don't spell it out. Things like that rarely were. But the clues are hard to miss. Historians like Plutarch and Strabo allude to something sinister, something even outsiders would have condemned. Modern scholars, piecing together bits of text and patterns of behavior, suspect Arsinoë may have endured sexual abuse from her father. There's no direct confession or letter, but the signs are there, etched in her early trauma and the policies she'd later enforce on an empire. At just 15, Arsinoë was married off to Lysimachus, one of her father's generals, a man old enough to be her granddad. Far from an escape, this marriage was just another cage. Lysimachus was harsh, paranoid, and quick to lash out. Arsinoë went from one tyrant to another, a father who used her and a husband who saw her as a means to secure heirs. But in Lysimachus' court, she learned the lesson that would shape her reign. Morality was for the weak. The powerful didn't need it, and they rarely had it. She saw her husband kill his own son on a mere suspicion, without a second thought. She learned how quickly a rumor could end a life, and bit by bit, she started to master the rules of survival. It wasn't a sudden transformation, crept in slowly. She didn't just wake up one day as a ruthless ruler. It was one choice at a time, one compromise after another. Each time she chose to survive over standing by her principles, she lost a piece of herself. By age 20, Arsinoë was a pro at the dark game of court politics. She had her own spies, struck secret deals, and, most crucially, learned to hide her true feelings behind a polished mask. She had 3 sons with Lysimachus, and for a brief moment it seemed like she might find some kind of calm. But this was the era of the decay, and peace was as fleeting as a desert breeze. When Lysimachus fell in battle in 281 BCE, Arsinoë was left a widow, raising her kids alone in a cutthroat world. That made her a walking target. Her royal blood and sons were a threat to anyone eyeing power. So, she made a move that still leaves historians stunned. She sent her boys to her half-brother, Ptolemy Ceraunus, who'd grabbed the Macedonian throne, and then, brace yourself, she married him. Yeah, her own half-brother. Even in a world where royal incest wasn't entirely shocking, this was a jaw-dropper. But Arsinoë wasn't chasing romance or passion. She was playing a high-stakes game of power. Ceraunus was erratic and brutal, but he held the crown, and she thought she could steer him. She miscalculated. Not long after their marriage, Ceraunus killed 2 of her sons, his own nephews, right before her eyes. And Arsinoë's response? No tears, no outbursts, no fury. Witnesses described an icy, almost eerie calm, because by now, she'd learned that showing weakness in the Ptolemaic world was a death sentence. She'd figured that out years ago. Her escape from Ceraunus wasn't just a desperate run for safety. It was a calculated, cold-blooded gamble straight out of a dark epic. She didn't slip away in royal finery. She went incognito, cloaked in disguise, moving stealthily through enemy lands with just a handful of loyal followers. Her brother husband had put a price on her head, so every town, harbor, and dusty trail was a potential trap. But Arsinoë had a trump card. She didn't hesitate to bend morals to survive. She paid off anyone who needed persuading. She used secrets, gathered over years of court espionage, to blackmail officials. Some historians even whisper that she might have quietly arranged the elimination of a few obstacles in her path, though we can't say for sure. After weaving through a maze of foes and former allies, she finally reached Alexandria. The ruler there was Ptolemy II Philadelphus, another half-brother, and their reunion would reshape Egypt's future. Ptolemy II was already married to Arsinoë I, not our Arsinoë, mind you, but that marriage was crumbling, with no male heirs to show for it. Arsinoë II saw her chance and seized it. She pulled out every trick in her arsenal. Charm, cunning, shared scars from their brutal upbringing, and sharp political instincts. Bit by bit, she convinced Ptolemy II not only to ditch his wife but to marry her, his full sister. Even in Egypt, where pharaohs had long wed their siblings, this caused a stir. What made it so staggering wasn't just the marriage itself, but how deliberately she orchestrated it. Arsinoë didn't just go along with the plan. She engineered it. She helped cook up treason charges against Arsinoë I to justify the divorce. Once the way was clear, she wed her brother and claimed her place as queen. But she wasn't content with just a crown. Arsinoë demanded real power to rule alongside him as an equal. Coins from their reign show their faces side by side, equal in stature. Official proclamations carried both their names, and she took the title Philadelphus, meaning sibling lover. What might have been a hushed scandal elsewhere became, under Arsinoë, a proud symbol of authority. The real change, though, wasn't in titles or coins, it was in policy. Arsinoë didn't just marry her brother. She made sibling marriage a state-mandated tradition. From then on, Ptolemaic rulers were expected to wed within the family, ideally their sisters. She sold this not just as a political move but as a divine one. In Egyptian lore, sibling pairs like Isis and Osiris were gods. Why shouldn't rulers follow suit? It wasn't just symbolic either. She wove this incestuous logic into laws, rituals, and festivals. She built a cult around herself and Ptolemy II, portraying their union as holy. Temples were raised in their honor. Priests were told to chant prayers celebrating the sibling gods. Poets were paid to write odes glorifying their marriage, recited in Alexandria's streets. It was a propaganda masterpiece. Arsinoë took her personal pain, abuse, incest, betrayal, and turned it into the foundation of an empire's ideology. In the short term, it paid off. Egypt was stable, the Ptolemaic grip on power ironclad. Rivals were crushed, legitimacy unquestioned. Alexandria hit a golden age, with trade booming and the Library of Alexandria drawing scholars and stargazers from across the globe. It was a time of wealth, learning, and culture. But beneath it all, something was festering. Sibling marriage kept power in the family, but it came with a heavy toll, biologically and mentally. Each generation grew frilier, sicker, more unhinged. And that decline traces straight back to Arsinoë II's choices. Her son, Ptolemy III, held things together well enough. But his kids, that's where the cracks started showing. Ptolemy IV was cruel, indulgent, said to drown his enemies in wine vats and toast over their bodies. Ptolemy VII, called Physcon or Fatty, was so overweight he could hardly move, paranoid, vicious, and known for ordering mass killings during feasts. It only got worse from there. Later Ptolemies murdered their mothers, married and then killed their nieces or sisters. Cleopatra too fought a civil war against her own brother-husband to save her daughter. Cleopatra III was strangled by her son during a dinner, and he reportedly sipped his wine afterward without a flinch. Records and genetic studies show a dynasty collapsing under its own tainted bloodline. Modern researchers have found signs of hemophilia, clubfoot, severe scoliosis, and other disorders in Ptolemaic mummies. The proud Greek conquerors had become a genetic disaster. Even Cleopatra VII, the famous one, wasn't spared. Her coin portraits, unlike the glamorous images we imagine, show exaggerated features, likely from generations of inbreeding. The damage wasn't just physical, though. The mental strain was crushing. Royal kids grew up knowing their siblings could one day be their spouses or their killers. Trust was a myth. Loyalty was a setup. Survival meant outsmarting your own family. That paranoia infected the entire court like a plague. Courtiers mimicked the royals' behavior. Incest, betrayal, murder, it all became routine. Abuse wasn't swept under the rug. It was part of the game. As this culture took hold, Egypt's whole system began to decay. Governors copied the royal family's ruthlessness. Priests mouthed blessings they didn't believe. Justifications for incest were parroted like slogans. Everyone was complicit, and nobody bought the lies anymore. Even the sacred realm of religion wasn't spared. The ancient Egyptian priesthood, which had endured for thousands of years, was gutted by its forced partnership with the ruling family. The old gods became mere props in a twisted royal soap opera. The spiritual heart of Egypt was replaced by state-backed cults of incest, masterminded by a queen who'd learned to wield her pain as a governing tool. The longer Arsinoë's rules held sway, the shakier the whole system got. From the outside, Egypt seemed mighty, but inside, it was falling apart. By the time Rome came calling, the Ptolemies were too fractured to put up a fight. Cleopatra VII, the final Ptolemaic ruler, is remembered as a clever, magnetic queen. But truth be told, her famous alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't strokes of genius. They were frantic grabs for survival. She was the last frayed thread of a tapestry unraveling from centuries of decay, dysfunction, and inbreeding. By the time she took the throne, the Ptolemaic Empire, once a powerhouse of conquest, learning, and wealth, was a hollow shell propped up by blood-stained customs. And at the root of that long decline was Arsinoë II, the queen who turned her personal wounds into the law of the land. When Arsinoë passed away in 270 BCE, she didn't fade into the shadows. Far from it, she was declared a goddess. Temples sprang up in her name. Hymns were chanted in her honor. Statues portrayed her as divine, flawless, eternal, untouchable. Yet, beneath the gold and marble, the cracks were already showing. Graffiti from her time in Alexandria tells a grittier tale, capturing the raw reactions of ordinary folks. Some scrawled lines poked fun at the sibling marriage. Others questioned whether the gods really blessed such unions. These weren't grand odes. They were sharp jabs etched into temple stones and back alleys. Even at the peak of her power, people sensed something was off. Her immediate heir, Ptolemy III, tried to keep her system alive, but the foundation was rotten. Every generation after him struggled to prop up a political and religious structure that just couldn't last. Once incest became a political must, every marriage turned into a gamble, every child a potential rival, every sibling a future foe. The dynasty became a gilded cage, a blood-drenched, soul-crushing prison where trust was impossible, and everyone lived in fear of betrayal by those closest to them. As the internal decay sped up, Egypt's place on the world stage started to slip. By the time Rome set its sights on the region, the Ptolemies were little more than figureheads ruling a crumbling state. Their downfall wasn't just Rome's might, it was their own brokenness. When Rome finally took Egypt in 30 BCE, the last flickers of Arsinoë's legacy went dark. But the damage was long done. Egypt, once the shining hub of the Mediterranean, home to pyramids, medicine, astronomy, and some of the world's earliest literature, had become a warning. It was now infamous for madness, incest, and treachery. Looking at Arsinoë II today, historians grapple with a tough question. How do you judge someone who was both victim and villain? There's no question she suffered abuse. Her childhood was filled with horrors that could have crushed anyone. Yet instead of breaking, she rose to power, reshaped an empire, and redefined what it meant to be a queen in the ancient world. Some modern scholars, particularly feminist historians, try to reframe her story. They argue she was a woman navigating a brutal world, making choices, however unsettling, that were her only path to power. They see her as a brilliant, resilient strategist who thrived in a man's game. There's truth in that, but it's only half the picture. Yes, her options were limited, but the road she took, making incest a policy, normalizing abuse, turning trauma into a state religion, caused lasting harm to her descendants, her people, and her entire civilization. Other scholars view her as a cautionary tale, a study in how unhealed trauma can fester into oppressive systems. From this angle, Arsinoë isn't just a tragic figure. She's a warning of what happens when deeply wounded people gain unchecked power. She turned her pain into policy, creating a system that normalized the very abuse that scarred her. You can see all the signs of profound trauma in her. Emotional coldness, an obsessive need for control, trouble forming real bonds, and a mindset that reduced everything, love, family, faith, to tools for dominance. But unlike many who repeat their traumas without thinking, Arsinoë seemed to know exactly what she was doing. She didn't act on whim. She made calculated plans. She built systems. She crafted stories. She created a cult around herself to justify every terrible policy and ensured those policies outlived her. That awareness makes her story all the more chilling. Her influence didn't die with her dynasty. Her story echoes even today. We see leaders now who normalize violence, twist morality to hold power, and use propaganda to turn personal pain into public systems. Think personality cults, state-backed abuse, or rigid ideologies. These aren't new tricks. Arsinoë II was one of their earliest architects. Her story isn't just ancient history, it's a reflection. It shows what happens when pain goes unhealed, when victims become perpetrators, when empires are shaped by one person's unresolved wounds. And it's not just personal. It's political, institutional, systemic. What Arsinoë II created wasn't just a dynasty. She built a machine, one that turned trauma into tradition, abuse into ritual, and incest into policy. Walk through the ruins of ancient Alexandria today, and you'll see fragments of her world. Shattered columns, broken statues, whispers of a city that once led the world in wisdom and beauty. But those ruins aren't just stone. They're psychological. They're the remnants of a civilization poisoned from within by its refusal to face the trauma at its core. Arsinoë II set out to survive, and she did. She gained power. She reshaped Egypt. She ensured her name would endure. By her own measures, she won. But that victory came at a terrible price. The suffering of generations, the moral collapse of a dynasty, and the fall of a great empire. She was both forged and undone by her trauma. In building herself, she tore everything else apart. Her story forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. Monsters aren't usually born. They're made. They're shaped, not born. And often, the ones who make it through aren't the toughest or the brightest, but those ready to give up everything. Their morals, their capacity for love, even the hope of a better tomorrow, just to hold on to power.